The crowd stood, their faces aglow with joy and pride as Pastor Daniel Grayson exchanged vows with his beautiful bride, Melissa Hart. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, and the community had come out in droves to celebrate the union of their beloved preacher and his sophisticated fiancée. Pastor Daniel was no ordinary man. He was a rising star in the evangelical world, a charismatic leader with a smile that could melt hearts and sermons that could bring even the most skeptical to their knees. He wasn't just a pastor, he was a celebrity. Daniel stood under the grand arch of flowers in his perfectly tailored white tuxedo, gazing at Melissa, who looked like an angel in her satin gown. Family members, church members, and even a few local politicians filled the pews of the grand outdoor cathedral. The choir hummed softly, their voices blending into the rustle of the breeze. A perfect day for a perfect union, or so it seemed. Just as the officiant began to declare them husband and wife, a loud crack echoed through the air. At first, many thought it was fireworks, perhaps part of the celebration. But then came the blood. Pastor Daniel staggered, his hand clutching his chest. His pristine white suit was now stained crimson, the dark liquid spreading like ink on a canvas. His eyes widened, filled with shock and pain, before his knees buckled. The crowd screamed as chaos erupted. Melissa screamed, dropping her bouquet as she tried to hold Daniel's lifeless body. People ducked for cover, some scrambling to locate the source of the gunfire. "Somebody call 911, a voice hollered. Panic swept over the once celebratory atmosphere. Guests scattered, their cheers replaced with cries of terror. But amidst the chaos, one figure stood frozen in the crowd. A woman dressed in a dark red dress and matching hat remained still, her eyes locked on the scene before her. Her lips twisted into a faint, almost satisfied smile before she turned and disappeared into the frantic sea of guests. By the time the paramedics arrived, Pastor Daniel was gone. The murder of Pastor Daniel Grayson wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. The headlines exploded across every news outlet within hours. Beloved preacher gunned down at wedding ceremony. Social media flooded with condolences, outrage, and speculation. Who would want to kill such a revered figure? And why? Enter Detective Vivian Cross, one of Atlanta's most seasoned investigators. A 45-year-old woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. Vivian wasn't just a cop, she was a bloodhound for the truth. She had seen the darkest corners of humanity, but never let the weight of it crush her. She worked alone, preferring the quiet hum of her thoughts over the noise of a partner. Vivian arrived at the scene later that evening. The venue, once pristine and decorated with roses, was now a taped-off crime scene littered with overturned chairs, trampled flowers, and streaks of blood. Officers and forensic specialists swarmed the area, collecting evidence. "Detective Cross," called a young officer, waving her over. "We found the bullet casing. Looks like a .308 caliber rifle." Vivian nodded, crouching to inspect the casing in its evidence bag. "Sniper shot. Clean, precise," she murmured. "This wasn't random. Whoever did this had training." She straightened up and glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the area. The shooter must have been positioned far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to ensure a clear shot. A professional job, she thought, but professional killers don't usually target preachers. Vivian's first stop was the distraught widow. Melissa sat in the back of a police car, her white gown now smeared with blood. Her makeup was streaked from tears, and her hands trembled as she gripped a tissue. "I'm Detective Vivian Cross," she introduced herself softly, crouching to Melissa's level. "I know this is a horrible time, but I need to ask you a few questions." Melissa nodded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. Why would someone do this? Daniel he was a good man." "That's what I'm here to find out," Vivian replied. "Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm him?" Melissa shook her head vigorously. Everyone loved Daniel. He was perfect." Vivian didn't press further. The grieving widow wasn't going to provide answers. Not yet. But someone else might. As the investigation deepened, whispers began to surface about Daniel's past. It turned out that before he was Pastor Daniel Grayson, he had lived a very different life. Born into a rough neighborhood, Daniel had been no stranger to trouble. He was an ex-gang member, a fact he had openly shared in his sermons as a testimony of redemption. But there was one detail he had never mentioned: the woman he left behind. Jade Monroe was her name, and she was trouble incarnate. A former felon with a rap sheet that included assault, drug charges, and fraud. Jade had been Daniel's girlfriend during his gang days. She was also the mother of his only child, a fact Daniel had kept secret from everyone, including Melissa. Vivian discovered this bombshell when she dug into Daniel's early life. "That's interesting," Vivian muttered to herself, staring at a grainy mugshot of Jade on her computer screen. "Baby mama with a criminal record. If I were writing this story, she'd be my prime suspect." She decided to pay Jade a visit. Jade lived in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of Atlanta. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap beer filled the air as Vivian climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor. She knocked on the door labeled 3B. The woman who answered was nothing like the radiant figures in wedding magazines. Jade was rough around the edges, with a fierce glare, and a chip on her shoulder. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her tattoos peeked out from under her tank top. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone defensive. "Jade Monroe," Vivian said, flashing her badge. "Detective Vivian Cross. I'm investigating the murder of Pastor Daniel Grayson." For a split second, Jade's face betrayed her. Her eyes widened, her lips parted slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Daniel's dead?" she said, feigning shock. "Yes." "Shot at his wedding?" Vivian replied, watching Jade's every move. "Do you mind if I come in?" Jade hesitated but eventually stepped aside. The apartment was cluttered but not filthy. Toys littered the floor, and the faint sound of cartoons played from the TV in the corner. "I heard you and Daniel have a child together," Vivian began, getting straight to the point. Jade smirked. "Is that what this is about? You think I killed him?" "Let me save you some time, Detective. I haven't seen Daniel in years. He abandoned us the moment he found God." "Did you resent him for that?" Vivian asked, her tone neutral. "Of course I did," Jade snapped. "He left me to raise our son on my own. But kill him? Number that man was dead to me long before someone put a bullet in him." Vivian studied Jade carefully. She was angry, bitter even. But was she a killer? Something about her story didn't sit right. As Vivian left the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jade knew more than she was letting on. And then there was the mysterious woman in red, captured briefly on a guest's cell phone video. Who was she? A jealous ex-lover? A hired gun? Or perhaps someone else entirely? The investigation was just beginning, and Vivian Cross knew one thing for certain. This murder was no act of random violence. It was personal, and every answer led to more questions. Detective Vivian Cross sat in her dimly lit office at the Atlanta Police Department, her desk cluttered with case files and coffee cups. She replayed the cell phone footage for the 100th time. It was grainy and shaky, but there was no mistaking the woman in red. Her dress stood out like a bloodstain against the backdrop of pastel gowns and suits. She moved through the crowd with purpose, her hat tilted low to obscure her face. Then, as chaos erupted, she slipped away, unnoticed by anyone but the camera. "Who are you?" Vivian muttered under her breath. The woman was a ghost. No one from the wedding had seen her enter or leave. No one knew her name. But Vivian was convinced she wasn't a random guest. This was a professional hit, and the woman in red was the key. Vivian decided to revisit the crime scene. Sometimes the smallest details went unnoticed in the chaos of the first sweep. The outdoor cathedral was eerily quiet now, stripped of its decorations and surrounded by police tape. The bloodstains on the altar were a grim reminder of the tragedy. She stood at the spot where Daniel had fallen, imagining the trajectory of the bullet. The sniper must have been positioned at an elevated angle. She scanned the surroundings until her eyes landed on a nearby office building with a clear line of sight to the altar. "Gotcha," she whispered. Vivian called in a team to search the rooftop of the office building. Within an hour, they found what she was looking for: a small pile of cigarette butts, a discarded coffee cup, and scuff marks on the rooftop railing. The sniper had been here. The coffee cup was rushed to the lab, and within hours, Vivian had her first lead. The fingerprints on the cup belonged to a man named Lyle Hendricks, a known mercenary with a long history of contract killings. Hendricks had been linked to several high-profile assassinations, but had never been caught. He was as elusive as he was deadly. Lyle Hendricks, Vivian said aloud, staring at his mugshot. He had a lean, rugged face with piercing eyes and a scar that ran down his left cheek. He looked like the type of man who'd kill without hesitation. But who had hired him? And where was he now? Vivian's search for Hendricks led her to a seedy motel on the outskirts of the city. The place was a haven for drifters and lowlifes, the kind of place where no one asked questions. She entered the lobby, her badge glinting under the flickering fluorescent lights. "I'm looking for a guest," she said to the board clerk behind the desk. "Lyle Hendricks." The clerk hesitated, glancing nervously at the badge. "He's in room 207, he muttered. "But I didn't see nothing, okay?" Vivian nodded and made her way upstairs. Her hand rested on her holstered gun as she approached the door. She knocked firmly. "Lyle Hendricks, this is Detective Vivian Cross. Open the door." There was no response, but she heard movement inside. Vivian drew her gun and kicked the door open. The room was empty, at least at first glance. Then she spotted the open window and the fire escape beyond. "Damn it," she muttered, rushing to the window. Hendricks was already halfway down the fire escape. "Stop! Police!" she shouted. But Hendricks didn't stop. He leapt the last few feet to the ground and took off running. Vivian raced after him, her boots pounding against the pavement. Hendricks was fast, but Vivian was relentless. She chased him through back alleys and abandoned lots, her heart pounding. Finally, she cornered him in a dead-end alley. "It's over, Hendricks," she said, her gun trained on him. "Don't make me shoot you." Hendricks raised his hand slowly, a sly smile spreading across his face. "All right, detective. You got me. But you'll never figure out who hired me." Back at the station, Hendricks sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He was cocky, almost smug, as Vivian entered. "So you're the famous Detective Cross," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Heard a lot about you, and I've heard a lot about you," Vivian replied, her voice cold. "Like how you were on that rooftop, pulling the trigger that killed Pastor Daniel Grayson." Hendricks smirked. "Prove it. We've got your fingerprints on a coffee cup found at the scene," she said. "And let me guess, you're going to say it's a coincidence?" Hendricks shrugged. "Could be. Coffee's popular." Vivian leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "You're a professional, Hendricks. You don't make mistakes, but you left that coffee cup behind because you wanted to be found. You're covering for someone, aren't you?" For the first time, Hendricks' smug expression faltered. It was brief, but Vivian caught it. "You think you're protecting someone," she continued. "But here's the thing about loyalty, Lyle. It's a one-way street. Whoever hired you won't hesitate to throw you under the bus if it means saving their own skin." Hendricks said nothing, his jaw tightening. Vivian pressed on. "Who hired you? Was it the woman in red or someone else?" "Talk, Lyle, because if you don't, I'll make sure you rot in prison for the rest of your life." Hendricks stared at her, his eyes cold. "You don't scare me, detective, and I'm not saying a word." Frustrated but undeterred, Vivian left the interrogation room. Hendricks wasn't going to talk, not yet, but she didn't need him to. She already had a new lead, the mysterious woman in red. Vivian returned to the evidence board in her office. Photos of the wedding, the rooftop, and the mugshots of Hendricks and Jade Monroe were pinned up, connected by red string. She stared at the photo of the woman in red, her mind racing. Who was she? A rival lover? A business associate? Or something even darker? Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's murder was about more than jealousy or revenge. There was a larger web of secrets, and she was only beginning to unravel it. Detective Vivian Cross sat in the conference room with her team, the walls lined with crime scene photos and witness statements. The tension was thick as they tried to piece together the story of Daniel Grayson's murder. It wasn't just a simple hit, it was personal. Someone had wanted him gone badly enough to hire a notorious killer like Lyle Hendricks. "What do we know about Daniel Grayson?" Vivian asked, tapping her pen against a file. "He was America's favorite preacher," said Officer Ramirez, flipping through his notes. "Built his empire from the ground up, hundreds of thousands of followers online, millions in donations every year. Married into money when he wed Julia Hanover. Her family owns several major businesses in Atlanta. Vivian frowned. What about before he became a preacher? Any skeletons in his closet? Well, Ramirez said, hesitating, there's this. He slid a file across the table. Vivian opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were police records from over 20 years ago. Assault, drug possession, petty theft. The name at the top, Daniel Monroe. Daniel Monroe, Vivian muttered. Grayson's birth name, Ramirez clarified. He grew up rough. Father in prison, mother working 2 jobs. Got into a lot of trouble as a teen. But something happened in his early 20s. He changed his name, disappeared for a while, and came back as Daniel Grayson, the preacher. Vivian leaned back in her chair, processing the information. Daniel Monroe and Jade Monroe, the ex-felon baby mama, shared the same last name. A coincidence? Unlikely. Run everything we have on Jade Monroe again, Vivian ordered, and pull any old records connecting her to Daniel. There's something we're missing. Later that afternoon, Vivian arrived at Jade Monroe's modest home in a rough Atlanta neighborhood. The house was small but tidy, with toys scattered across the front yard. Jade answered the door, her eyes wary. Detective, she said, crossing her arms. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon. I have a few more questions, Vivian replied. Mind if I come in? Jade hesitated but stepped aside. The living room was cozy, filled with photos of her and a young boy, her son. Vivian glanced at the photos, noting the boy's features. He looks a lot like Daniel, Vivian said. Jade stiffened. Is there a point to this visit? I know about your past with Daniel, Vivian said, cutting to the chase. You two were married, weren't you? Jade's eyes flashed with anger. I don't know what you're talking about. You were Jade Monroe, and he was Daniel Monroe, Vivian pressed. You were together before he became a preacher. But something happened, didn't it? He left you. Jade's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Vivian continued, her voice softer. I know it must have hurt, Jade, raising his son on your own while he built a new life for himself. But murder won't bring you peace. Jade laughed bitterly. Murder? You think I had something to do with this? Let me tell you something, Detective. Daniel left me, yes, but I moved on. I didn't kill him. Then tell me who did, Vivian said. Who wanted him dead? Jade stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. Daniel made enemies, Detective. He stepped on people to get to the top. People with power. People who don't forgive. Names, Vivian demanded. Jade shook her head. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. These aren't people you mess with. Back at the station, Vivian's team uncovered another bombshell. Julia Hanover, Daniel's widow, had been funneling large sums of money from her family's businesses into offshore accounts. The transactions were flagged as suspicious by financial analysts. Looks like someone was preparing for a rainy day, Ramirez said, handing Vivian the report. Vivian frowned. Julia had played the grieving widow perfectly, but the financial records painted a different picture. Why was she hoarding millions in offshore accounts? Vivian decided it was time to pay Julia a visit. Julia Hanover sat in her sprawling mansion, her face pale but composed. She offered Vivian tea as they sat in the ornate living room. I'm not sure what else I can tell you, Detective, Julia said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I've answered all your questions. Not quite, Vivian replied, pulling out the financial report. Can you explain these transactions? Julia's eyes widened. I don't know what this is. You've been moving millions into offshore accounts for months, Vivian said. And don't tell me you didn't know. That kind of money doesn't just disappear without your knowledge. Julia's hands trembled as she set her teacup down. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, Vivian demanded. Julia hesitated before finally breaking down. I was protecting myself, she admitted. Daniel, he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He had habits, dark ones, drugs, gambling, women. He drained our accounts, and I was trying to make sure my family wouldn't go bankrupt. Why didn't you go to the police? Vivian asked. Do you know what it would have done to his reputation? Julia said, her voice rising. To my family's reputation? Daniel was the face of our empire. If people found out the truth, it would all come crashing down. Vivian studied her, weighing her words. Julia seemed genuinely distressed, but there was still something she wasn't saying. "Where were you during the shooting?" Vivian asked suddenly. Julia's eyes narrowed. "You're not seriously accusing me, are you?" "I'm just covering all my bases," Vivian said. "I was sitting right next to him," Julia snapped. "Surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. I had nothing to do with this." Vivian leaned forward. "Maybe not directly, but if you know who did, now's the time to tell me." Julia said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. As Vivian left the mansion, her mind raced. Daniel's past, Jade's warnings, Julia's secrets. Everything pointed to a larger conspiracy, but the woman in red still eluded her, as did the motive behind the hit. Vivian returned to the station, staring at the evidence board. She began connecting the dots. Daniel's past. He wasn't just a preacher. He had enemies from his old life. Julia's money. She was protecting herself from someone or something. Jade's warnings. Powerful people were involved. The key to solving the case was finding the woman in red. "Run her image through every facial recognition database we have," Vivian ordered Ramirez. "I don't care how long it takes. Find her." As the team got to work, Vivian felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The deeper she dug, the darker the truth became. Whoever killed Daniel Grayson wasn't just seeking revenge. They were sending a message, and Vivian was determined to find out what it was. The crackling sound of a printer broke the silence in the investigation room as Ramirez brought over a newly enhanced image. The face of the woman in red was now clearer, her sharp features and piercing gaze captured mid-stride at the wedding scene. "Facial recognition came back with a hit," Ramirez announced. "Her name's Sabrina Lyons, age 36, former escort turned high-end fixer for the elite. She's not a stranger to controversy, but she's slippery, never been convicted of anything." Vivian studied the image carefully. Sabrina's fiery red dress and confident demeanor from the video replayed in her mind. She wasn't just some random guest. She had been there for a reason. "Get me everything on Sabrina Lyons," Vivian said. "Phone records, known associates, financials. I want to know who hired her and why she was at that wedding." A quick search into Sabrina's background revealed that she was well connected. Her clientele ranged from wealthy businessmen to corrupt politicians. What stood out, however, was a familiar name. Lyle Hendricks, the man caught fleeing the scene of the murder. "There's no way that's a coincidence," Vivian muttered. Further digging revealed that Sabrina had recently rented a car in Atlanta. Surveillance footage from the rental agency showed her picking up the car a day before the wedding. Vivian called the agency and got a list of all tolls and parking charges associated with the car. By the time the results came back, it was clear Sabrina had been tracking someone in the days leading up to the wedding. Her movements mirrored Daniel Grayson's. She was stalking him, Vivian concluded, or preparing for something. That evening, Vivian received a call from Ramirez. "You're going to want to see this," he said. Vivian rushed back to the station, where Ramirez handed her another financial report. "This is from one of Julia Hanover's offshore accounts," Ramirez explained. "There's a transaction to a shell company registered under Sabrina Lyons' alias. $50,000. 2 weeks before the wedding." Vivian's stomach sank. Julia Hanover had paid Sabrina Lyons. "What's the timeline?" Vivian asked. "The payment was made before the wedding," Ramirez said. "But here's the kicker. There's another payment. This one's from Sabrina to Lyle Hendricks. $20,000. 3 days before the wedding." Vivian's mind raced. Julia had paid Sabrina, and Sabrina had paid Lyle. It was a money trail linking the grieving widow to the murder. Vivian didn't waste time. She drove straight to the Hanover mansion, the evidence burning a hole in her pocket. Julia greeted her at the door, her polished smile fading when she saw the determined look on Vivian's face. "We need to talk," Vivian said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Julia folded her arms, her posture defensive. "What is this about now?" Vivian dropped the financial report on the table. "Care to explain why you paid Sabrina Lyons $50,000? And why she then paid Lyle Hendricks to kill your husband?" Julia's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb," Vivian snapped. We have the transactions. You hired Sabrina, and she hired Lyle. Tell me the truth, Julia. Why did you want your husband dead? Julia's composure cracked. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling. You don't understand, she whispered. Then make me understand, Vivian said, her voice firm. Julia took a shaky breath. Daniel wasn't who you think he was. He was cruel, controlling. Behind closed doors, he was a monster. He threatened to destroy me, to ruin my family if I ever left him. I was trapped. So you hired someone to kill him? Vivian pressed. I didn't know they were going to kill him, Julia cried. I swear, I just wanted Sabrina to scare him, to make him back off. But things got out of hand. Out of hand? Vivian repeated. You paid a known fixer, and she hired a hitman. What did you think was going to happen? Julia buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. With Julia's confession, the case seemed to be falling into place, but Vivian knew there were still unanswered questions. Sabrina Lyons and Lyle Hendricks were professionals. They wouldn't have acted without clear instructions. And then there was the matter of Daniel's past. Who else might have wanted him dead? Vivian returned to the station and started connecting the dots. She laid out the timeline. Julia pays Sabrina. Sabrina hires Lyle. Lyle kills Daniel at the wedding. But why? Julia claimed she hadn't wanted Daniel dead, but her actions told a different story. The breakthrough came the next day when Vivian's team located Sabrina Lyons. She was holed up in a luxury hotel in Miami using a fake name. A SWAT team brought her in without incident. Sabrina sat across from Vivian in the interrogation room, her red lipstick untouched despite hours of questioning. You've been hired to do a lot of dirty work, Vivian began. But murder, that's new for you, isn't it? Sabrina smirked. I don't know what you're talking about. We have the money trail, Vivian said, sliding the financial reports across the table. Julia Hanover paid you, and you paid Lyle Hendricks. Tell me the truth, Sabrina. Who ordered the hit? Sabrina's smile faltered. I don't give up my clients, she said, her voice cool. Julia's already confessed, Vivian lied. She told us everything. You might want to start talking if you want a deal. Sabrina's eyes narrowed. She confessed, huh? Did she tell you why she was so scared of her husband? What do you mean? Vivian asked, leaning forward. Sabrina chuckled bitterly. Daniel Grayson wasn't just a preacher. He was a predator. He ruined lives, mine included. Julia wasn't the only one who wanted him dead. Who else? Vivian demanded. Sabrina hesitated, then leaned in close. Check his congregation, detective. You'll find more skeletons than you can count. As Sabrina's words sank in, Vivian realized the case was far from over. Daniel Grayson's murder wasn't just about a broken marriage or a hired hit. It was about power, secrets, and the lives he had destroyed. Vivian knew one thing for sure. The deeper she dug, the darker the truth would become. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Vivian's office as she sifted through the files Ramirez had compiled overnight. Sabrina Lyons' cryptic warning about Daniel's congregation echoed in her mind. On the surface, Daniel Grayson's followers adored him, painting him as a larger-than-life preacher who could bring people to their knees with his sermons. But Vivian had a gut feeling. There was something sinister hidden beneath their unwavering devotion. Vivian instructed Ramirez to dig into Daniel's history as a preacher, his rise to fame, his personal dealings with church members, and, most importantly, any complaints or scandals that might have been buried. Within hours, Ramirez returned with a file that made Vivian's stomach churn. Daniel's church, Grace Redeemed Fellowship, has a reputation for being selective, Ramirez explained, laying out a report. Apparently, he handpicked his inner circle, wealthy donors, influential members, and vulnerable single women who sought spiritual counseling. Vivian frowned. Define vulnerable. Ramirez sighed. Several women filed complaints against Daniel over the years, claiming he preyed on them emotionally and financially. None of the claims ever went public. The church paid hush money, and the women were pressured into signing non-disclosure agreements. Let me guess, Vivian said. No criminal charges? Ramirez nodded grimly. Not a single one. Vivian's jaw clenched. Sabrina had been right. Daniel wasn't just a preacher. He was a predator. Vivian decided to interview members of Daniel's congregation. starting with his former staff. Most were reluctant to speak, their loyalty to the late preacher unshaken. But one person, Angela Carter, a former secretary at the church, finally broke the silence. Angela sat nervously across from Vivian, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. Daniel wasn't the man people thought he was, Angela began. He had a way of manipulating people, especially women. He made them feel special, like they were chosen by God. But it was all a lie. Did he ever cross the line with you? Vivian asked gently. Angela hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. He tried. When I refused, he turned cold. He cut my hours, spread rumors about me to the congregation. I had no choice but to quit. Vivian leaned forward. Do you know anyone else he hurt? Angela nodded. There was a woman, Maria Ruiz. She was part of his prayer group. One day she just disappeared. I heard she tried to confront Daniel about something, but no one's seen her since. Vivian's pulse quickened. When was this? About 6 months ago, Angela said, right before he announced his engagement to Julia. Maria Ruiz's name wasn't in the police database, but a deeper search revealed a missing persons report filed by her sister. According to the report, Maria had been last seen leaving Grace Redeemed Fellowship after an evening service. Her car was found abandoned on a remote highway days later, but there were no leads and the case went cold. Vivian felt a chill run down her spine. Maria's disappearance wasn't just a coincidence. It was connected to Daniel. Ramirez walked in with more files. You're going to want to see this, he said, handing over a report. Financial records show that Daniel withdrew $25,000 in cash from the church's account the week Maria vanished. No explanation, no paper trail. Vivian stared at the report. What about Sabrina Lyons? Was she involved? Not directly, Ramirez replied. But get this, Sabrina was in town that same week. She stayed at a hotel near the church. And guess who paid for her stay? Daniel, Vivian muttered. Ramirez nodded. If Maria threatened to expose him, Sabrina might have been called in to handle the situation. Vivian brought Sabrina Lyons back into the interrogation room. This time she didn't bother with pleasantries. Tell me about Maria Ruiz, Vivian said, sliding a photo across the table. Sabrina's eyes flickered with recognition, but she kept her composure. Never heard of her. Don't lie to me, Sabrina, Vivian snapped. We know you were in town when she disappeared. We know Daniel paid for your hotel, and we know you're the one he called when things got messy. Sabrina leaned back in her chair, her red lips curling into a smirk. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But you're missing one crucial piece. Then enlighten me, Vivian said, her voice icy. Sabrina's smile faded. Daniel wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was just another pawn in a much bigger game. Vivian's brow furrowed. What game? The church, Sabrina said. Grace Redeemed Fellowship isn't just a place of worship, it's a business, a very profitable one. And there are people who do anything to protect their investment, even if it means eliminating threats like Maria. Sabrina's words opened a new line of inquiry. Vivian and Ramirez began investigating the church's financials, focusing on its board of directors. What they found was a web of corruption and greed. Grace Redeemed Fellowship wasn't just funded by donations. It was laundering money for criminal enterprises. The board members, wealthy businessmen and politicians, used the church as a front for their illegal activities. Maria Ruiz, it seemed, had stumbled upon the scheme. She had confided in Daniel, hoping he would take action. Instead, he had turned to the very people she was trying to expose. That's why Sabrina was called in, Vivian realized. Maria wasn't just a threat to Daniel, she was a threat to the entire operation. As Vivian pieced together the puzzle, a disturbing picture emerged. Daniel Grayson had been complicit in the church's corruption, but he wasn't in control. The real power lay with the board, a shadowy group willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. Maria's disappearance, Daniel's murder, and Julia's involvement all pointed to the same conclusion. Grace Redeemed Fellowship wasn't a house of God. It was a house of lies. Vivian knew she was getting close to the truth, but the closer she got, the more dangerous the case became. Vivian's office was dimly lit as she pinned photos and documents to the corkboard that now dominated one wall. each thread tied back to Grace Redeemed Fellowship's board of directors. These were no ordinary church officials. They were a collection of wealthy individuals with ties to organized crime, politics, and multi-million-dollar enterprises. The deeper Vivian dug, the clearer it became. Daniel Grayson was only a piece of the puzzle. His charisma had been exploited to mask the church's darker operations, and when he became a liability, they silenced him. The church's financial records painted a damning picture. Donations which members believed went toward charity were being funneled into offshore accounts. One name stood out repeatedly: George Redmond, the chairman of the church's board and a prominent real estate tycoon. George Redmond practically owns the city, Ramirez said as he laid out Redmond's profile. He has politicians in his pocket, controls half the media, and has a team of lawyers ready to bury anyone who comes after him. Not this time, Vivian said firmly. But George wasn't the only player. Vivian discovered that two other board members, Linda Carson, a pharmaceutical executive, and Michael Ross, a construction magnate, had equally damning ties to illegal activities. Together, they had built a network of power and influence that protected their empire. Daniel got greedy, Vivian said, piecing the timeline together. Maria Ruiz found out about the laundering, and Daniel tried to contain it. But when Maria threatened to go public, the board panicked. They couldn't afford the fallout. And Daniel? Ramirez asked. Vivian nodded grimly. He became expendable. A breakthrough came when a former church accountant, Harold Green, came forward. Harold had been fired 2 years earlier after questioning discrepancies in the church's finances. They were moving millions, Harold said, his voice trembling. At first, I thought it was for charity work overseas, but the numbers didn't add up. When I raised concerns, Redmond personally threatened me, said I'd regret it if I didn't mind my place. What about Maria Ruiz? Vivian asked. Harold hesitated. Maria came to me a few months before she disappeared. She'd found some of the same discrepancies I did. I told her to leave it alone, but she was determined. Said God wanted her to expose the truth. Vivian's stomach churned. Maria's faith had been her downfall. Julia Grayson's role in the conspiracy became clearer as well. Bank records showed several large deposits into her personal account, all originating from the church's coffers. Julia, it seemed, had been complicit in the laundering scheme, using her upcoming marriage to Daniel as a way to strengthen her ties to the board. Julia wasn't just marrying Daniel, Vivian said to Ramirez. She was securing her place in their empire. Do you think she knew they were planning to kill him? Ramirez asked. Maybe, Vivian said, or maybe she thought she'd inherit his position in the church. Either way, she benefited from his death. Vivian and Ramirez obtained a warrant to search the church's security footage from the weeks leading up to the wedding. What they found sent shivers down their spines. The footage showed Sabrina Lyons meeting with George Redmond in his office late one night. The two spoke for nearly an hour, their body language tense. A week later, Sabrina was seen entering a black SUV registered to Michael Ross, and they drove off together. They planned it, Ramirez said. Sabrina was their cleaner. She took care of Maria and Daniel. Vivian nodded. But they didn't count on Sabrina's arrogance. She's the weak link. Vivian brought Sabrina back in for questioning. This time, she wasn't interested in subtlety. We know you worked for the board, Vivian said, throwing a folder of evidence onto the table. We have footage of you meeting with Redmond. We know about your connection to Michael Ross, and we know you were in town when Maria Ruiz disappeared. Sabrina's composure cracked. You don't understand, she hissed. They don't just kill people. They erase them. If I talk, I'm dead. Not if we protect you, Vivian said. Sabrina laughed bitterly. You can't protect me from Redmond. He owns everything, everyone. Not anymore, Vivian said. We've already opened a federal investigation. The IRS is looking into their finances. Once the FBI gets involved, Redmond's empire will crumble. But we need your testimony to seal the case. Sabrina hesitated, her fear palpable. If I do this, I want immunity. You'll get it, Vivian promised. With tears streaming down her face, Sabrina finally confessed. Maria Ruiz found out about the money laundering, she said. She confronted Daniel, thinking he'd do the right thing. But Daniel was terrified of Redmond. He told them everything. Redmond ordered Maria's death, Sabrina continued. I was the one who lured her to that abandoned highway. Michael Ross took care of the rest. Vivian felt a lump in her throat. And Daniel? Redmond didn't trust him after Maria. He thought Daniel might crack under pressure. Julia knew about the plan. She even helped set it up. She was tired of playing second fiddle to Daniel. She wanted to be the one in control. Vivian and Ramirez worked tirelessly to build their case. Sabrina's confession, combined with the financial records and surveillance footage, was enough to secure warrants for Redmond, Ross, and Carson. The arrest made national headlines, exposing the corruption at the heart of Grace Redeemed Fellowship. The congregation was left in shock as the truth about their beloved preacher and his associates came to light. But for Vivian, the case wasn't over. Maria Ruiz's body had never been found, and until it was, there could be no true closure. The courtroom was packed. News of the arrests had spread like wildfire, and the trial of George Redmond, Michael Ross, and Linda Carson had become the most sensational legal drama in recent memory. Vivian sat quietly in the back, watching the prosecution lay out its case piece by piece as she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The evidence was damning. Sabrina Lyons, now under federal protection, became the star witness. Her testimony was chilling as she recounted every detail of Maria Ruiz's murder and Daniel Grayson's assassination. Maria was just trying to do the right thing, Sabrina said, her voice breaking on the stand. But the people she trusted, they used her faith against her. And Daniel, he wasn't innocent, but he didn't deserve to die like that. The financial records Vivian and Ramirez uncovered solidified the case. Each transaction, each deposit, each withdrawal painted a vivid picture of the corruption and greed that had rotted the core of Grace Redeemed Fellowship. Julia Grayson, once celebrated as the grieving widow, had her day in court as well. Though she denied any involvement, Sabrina's testimony and the bank records tied her to the conspiracy. Her cold, detached demeanor on the stand only alienated the jury further. Even as the trial unfolded, Vivian couldn't let go of Maria Ruiz. Her disappearance haunted her, a loose end that needed tying. A break came when Sabrina, during a private conversation, let slip a key detail. Maria was taken to the river. Michael said it was symbolic, washing away the problem. With this new information, Vivian and a team of forensic divers searched the winding, murky waters of the Hudson River. It took days, but they eventually recovered a shallow grave near the riverbank. The remains were identified as Maria Ruiz, her body wrapped in a tarp weighted down with stones. Vivian stood silently as the medical examiner zipped up the body bag. "You deserved better," she whispered. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned their verdicts. Guilty on all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and money laundering. Guilty of murder and conspiracy. Guilty of financial fraud and aiding and abetting murder. Guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. As the sentences were read, the courtroom erupted in applause. For the families of Maria Ruiz and Daniel Grayson, it was a moment of vindication. With its leaders disgraced and imprisoned, Grace Redeemed Fellowship disbanded. Its members, many of whom had been duped into donating their life savings, struggled to rebuild their faith and trust. The church's assets were seized and redistributed to compensate the victims. For many, it was a hollow victory, but it marked the end of an era of corruption. Vivian returned to her office, exhausted but fulfilled. The case had tested her limits, pushing her to uncover truth that many would have preferred stayed buried. Ramirez knocked lightly on her door. "You did it," he said. "Justice for Maria, for Daniel." "It doesn't bring them back," Vivian replied. "No, but it means their stories won't be forgotten." Vivian visited Maria Ruiz's grave a week after the funeral. The headstone read, "Maria Ruiz, 1988 to 2025. A voice for truth, silenced but never forgotten." She placed a single white lily on the grave, her heart heavy but at peace. Maria's courage had sparked the chain of events that brought a powerful empire to its knees. As Vivian walked away, she vowed to continue fighting for the voiceless, for the Mariahs of the world who dared to stand up against corruption. Justice had been served, but the work was far from over.